And so you have the sense that the boys are being offered bread in circuses, roughly speaking. But there's a real reason for it. There's a manipulative reason for it. They're being enticed into a trap. And the doors are closed, and these underground beings are involved in the plot. And obviously the coachman understands this perfectly well. And so one of the ways to understand this is to think about what totalitarian states have to offer their populace and what they offer them. And this happened particularly as Rome declined, let's say. That's where the term bread in circuses originally came from, is that as the situation degenerates, then people have to be offered stupid amusements more and more frequently in order for them to ignore what's actually going on in the background. And, a war can be that kind of stupid amusement. Anyways, later that night, the entire place is completely devastated, and all we see is the wreckage of everything that was there before. And again, the cricket has got separated from Pinocchio, and so he's trying to find him, and Pinocchio ends up in this bar that's shaped like an 8-ball. 8-ball is kind of the random ball in pool. And anyways, he's inside the 8-ball, and he's shooting pool with Lampwick, and that's just another indication of wasting his time, basically. And you can see in the forefront there's some cards for gambling, and so he's engaged in these sort of you might say pointless hedonic pursuits. And Lampwick picks him up by the scruff of the neck, roughly speaking, and first of all asks who he is. So obviously he's divorced from his own conscience, and then makes fun of Pinocchio for paying attention to this little bug. And that's kind of a nice indication of what happens in adolescence, because of course as the children move away from their parents and into their groups, especially when the groups are misbehaving, often what happens is that the other members of the group will torture a person who isn't willing to try something dangerous or foolish by making fun of the fact that they're, too attached to their conscience. And there's a positive element to that, because you should take some risks when you're a teenager and also later in life. And so if you won't take any risks, there's actually something wrong with you. But there's a negative element in that, well, teenagers do all sorts of stupid things, and perhaps it's amazing that we all live through it, actually, as far as I'm concerned. And some people take extraordinary risks, and they don't make it through at all, or they end up in the permanently antisocial population. And then they're, basically career criminals. 5% of the criminals commit 95% of the crimes. It's another Pareto distribution. So, anyways, Lampwick isn't going to listen to Pinocchio or to the cricket. He laughs at him with this kind of braying laugh, which is some foreshadowing, and the cricket gets all upset, puts his coat on backwards, and ends up dumped down a pool table hole and otherwise abused. And so he stomps on out of there. He tells Pinocchio that he can take care of himself, and he stomps on out of there. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right. And so anyways, the cricket doesn't, you can see one of those black suited horrors here hauling donkeys out of this crate, and one of them has a hat on, and they look very sad, and they're in different crates, and one of them says sold to the salt mines, and one says sold to the circus, and so they're shipped off to be slaves, roughly speaking, and they look very sad. And then one of them gets hauled out of a crate, and he's still got a hat, he has a hat on and a sweater, and he can still talk. boy, it turns out, that's been half transformed into a jackass, a braying jackass, prior to being enslaved. And so that's another thing that's quite interesting about the story. You know, it also makes the case that if you replace your voice with stupid braying, that the probability that you're going to become enslaved by a tyrant is extraordinarily high. And the coachman basically throws him back into the crate and says that he's not ready yet. And the reason for that is that he still had the power of independent speech. You remember, right at the beginning of the movie, when the mouth was painted on Pinocchio, we saw that mask that was really glaring at the process. I said that character recurs continually throughout the movie, and this is a good example of that because the coachman is the enemy of anything that has its own voice. So he's the anti-Geppetto. That's a good way of thinking about it. He's the tyrannical aspect of the culture. But insofar as one of these mostly donkeys, mostly jackasses can still talk, then they're not completely fit for slavery. And you remember this movie was also being made at about the same time that the Nazi transformation of Germany was taking place. And so all these terrible underground things, you know, this process whereby people were being reduced to ideological slaves, say, and in this terrible process that was all playing out in Europe in a very big way. And it's not like people weren't aware of that, you know, it was in the air. And so then Pinocchio grows jackass ears, and he's absolutely terrified by it as well. He knows what's coming. And the cricket comes back and guides him off Pleasure Island. And so then they end up on a cliff, because this is an island after all, and they have to jump into the unknown, right? Out of this impulsive, adolescent, hedonic playground into the unknown.